successful and a holding again at all times.
Be careful.
Government officials insist that this is an isolated incident of the second emergence. But then, no perhaps we will continue to keep you informed of the story.
Robertson County, Tennessee, 1820. A man walks his own land with his son. He's not a wealthy man nor a famous one. He's a simple farmer, a church elder, a neighbor people trusted and came to when things went wrong. A man who had done what men of his generation were supposed to do. He left what was familiar. He crossed into territory that hadn't been tamed yet. And he built something out of nothing with his own hands and his faith and his stubbornness. He had left North Carolina for this ground. He crossed rivers that didn't have bridges yet, moved his family through country that was still raw and contested and dangerous. He cleared the land himself, built the home himself, planted the fields. He established himself as a man of standing in a community that was still figuring out what it was going to be. 16 years he worked this ground, and for the last 3 of them, something has been trying to kill him on it. Not quickly nor mercifully, but slowly, deliberately. The way you dismantle something when you want it to suffer the dismantling. It started with sounds in the walls, then voices, then something that knew things it had no business knowing, and said things no neighbor or stranger or grief or illness could account for. It came for his youngest daughter first, pulled her hair in the night, smothered her in her sleep, struck her across the face in front of witnesses until she said she would drink poison if it meant being free of whatever it was. It humiliated a detective on the floor. It ran a conjurer out of the county on a horse that wouldn't stop. They say it also stopped Andrew Jackson's wagon on a public road and made the most powerful man in Tennessee spend a sleepless night wondering what was in that house. None of them could do anything about it. None of them could even correctly identify what it was, and through all of it, John Bell got worse. The affliction that targeted him specifically, the facial spasms, the difficulty swallowing, the episodes that left him incapacitated for days, it never stopped. It never relented. It never showed him the smallest measure of the tenderness it occasionally showed his wife, or the respect it occasionally showed his son. It told his family directly, more than once, that it had come for him, that it would follow him to the remotest part of the earth, that it would not stop until he was gone. This is that man walking his own land, walking with his son Richard beside him. That day his shoes inexplicably flew off his feet. They just flew off, no explanation, no warning. The way things happened in that house, without cause, without logic, without any concession to the world working the way the world is supposed to work. Richard picked them up, replaced them, tied them tightly, but they flew off again. And then came the blow. Something like an open hand across the face, hard enough that John Bell, a grown man, a man who crossed wild country and built a life in it, sits down on a log. His face begins to twitch and contort. The thing that has been happening to him for 3 years, the thing the doctors couldn't diagnose, and the ministers couldn't stop, and the conjurers couldn't touch, working through him again while his son watched, and the trees stood still, and somewhere in the woods around them, something dark was pleased with itself. Because then the laughter came. A laughter that came from everywhere at once, that has been watching this man cross this property for 3 years and is watching him now and is not done with him yet and knows it and wants him to know it too. Richard looks at his father. There are tears on John Bell's face. Again, the man who crossed unmapped country, who absorbed years of something inexplicable living in his house without breaking in front of his community, who maintained his standing as a church elder and a respected neighbor and a man people came to with their problems, while something in his own walls announced nightly that it wanted to destroy him. And now he's sitting on a log on his own land, with tears streaming down his face. He said to his son, "Not long will you have a father to wait on so patiently. I cannot much longer survive the persecutions of this terrible thing. It is killing me by slow tortures, and I feel that the end is nigh." That's not a man performing for a room. There is no room. There is no audience except his son and whatever is still laughing at him in the trees. That's a man telling his son the truth because the truth can no longer be withheld. And a son old enough to receive it deserves to hear it from his father directly, rather than piece it together later from what's left behind. Then John Bell does something Richard had apparently never seen from him with this kind of intensity. He got on his knees right in his field, while something dark laughed at him from every direction, and he simply prayed. Not a formal prayer, not the measured prayer of a man standing in a pew who has done this 1,000 times and knows where it starts and where it ends. Not the prayer of a man who's confident about the outcome. The prayer of a man who has run out of every other option and is asking for the one thing he isn't sure is coming. He asks that if it were possible, this affliction might pass. He asks for courage and faith for his family, not for himself, for his family, even here, even now. Even on his knees in a field while something dark laughs at him and his face won't stop moving and his shoes won't stay on his feet and his son is standing there watching him come apart, he still asks on behalf of his family. And then something happens that the account describes and that I don't have a better word for than grace. A calmness settles over him. The episode fades. The laughter stops. They walk back to the house together. But John Bell would never leave his home again. This is the most dramatic moment for me, not with the vial they found where his medicine should have been, not with the dark liquid nobody could identify and the cat that convulsed and died when they tested it, not with the blue flame up the chimney or the voice declaring in a joyous tone at his funeral that it had given old Jack a big dose and finished the job. Those are the details most people remember and retell and build legends upon, but they're not where the story ends for me. For me, it ended in that field, with a man on his knees, asking God for something he wasn't sure was coming. And he got up anyway, and he walked back to his house. He walked through his door, and he never left again. That is the Bell Witch, not the voice on the wall, not the committees and the conjurers and the generals, not the pins and needles and the witch doctors' concoctions, not any of the spectacle this case has been wrapped up in for 200 years. It's that moment in the field. A man who was being dismantled piece by piece on ground he built his whole life on by something he could not name or fight or reason with or escape. A man who got on his knees anyway and asked God for help, and got up and walked home when the asking was done. That's not a man who was destroyed by what came for him. That's a man who was broken by it and chose faithfulness anyway. Those are not the same thing. And that difference is what 3 episodes have been building toward. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Dancing Toaster. This is Pastor Nelly, and this is the place where we wrestle with the intersection of faith and the unexplained. Today we are concluding our first 3-parter. Full disclosure, when I started this case, I did not intend for it to go into 3 parts. If I had, I would have done it a lot differently, but here we are, and I really hope you've enjoyed it. Some of y'all confused me, though. More people checked out part 2 than part 1, but I'm just glad you're here. Welcome back, whatever part you decide to jump in on. I also hope you enjoyed the return of Dr. Wright and Vinny. What are you talking about? Of course they did. What's the matter with you?
Vinny's a hard pill to swallow, but I'm sure they enjoyed my wit and my wisdom.
Yeah, I'm sure they enjoyed it as much as a dental appointment.
Speaking of dental appointments, did you ever get them listening devices out of your teeth, basement dweller?
Hey, don't even joke about that. I don't need them coming back and putting them in again. I think we've heard enough of you two for now. Thank you guys for coming back, and thank all of you coming back to listen. You could be listening to anything else right now, but you're here, and I'm so grateful for that. Big thank you to my toasties. They are the patrons over on Patreon. I know things are getting tighter every day, so your decision to support the work I do means the world to me. I'm really working on adding more value to that membership. Thank you for those that have patiently stuck around, even though exclusives have been slow coming. It's finally time to wrap up our first three-parter, but before we do, I also want to thank Tim over at Six Sensory Podcast. We had an amazing conversation about a week ago that we'll release this summer over on his show. I'll keep you posted on that. I want to thank him for letting me join him. We had a great time, and some of what we discussed greatly influenced part 3 of this saga. So thank you, Tim. I'm sure you'll appreciate today's conclusion. It's time to go back to Robertson County, folks, one final time. When we were last on the Bell Farm, they had unfortunately reached into the dark for help, overcoming the dark. And though that may fly in comics and in anime, it doesn't work in real life. The conjurer, Solomon Mize, failed to bring the Bells any relief, and the Bell Witch, whatever she was, gave him the Sons of Skeva treatment. He was beaten and chased off just like those Jewish exorcists in Acts 19 when Paul was in Ephesus. Unfortunately, the family didn't learn from the failure of the conjurer. The record indicates they also reached out to a witch doctor who offered Betsy a harsh medical treatment. Betsy said she would take medicine even if it were poison if it might rid her of the witch's attentions. Now that's the statement of someone who has been ground down so completely that the risk of being poisoned no longer registered as a meaningful deterrent. Whatever caution she had started with was long gone. Like her father, she had become that desperate. According to the account, the witch doctor claimed he could end her torment. She took the mysterious dose he offered. She became deathly ill almost immediately. The witch doctor assured the Bells this was expected, and then we're told Betsy released some pins and needles. Now, when I retold the story weeks ago in part 1, I said she vomited them, as this is the popularized and more sanitized version, but in Ingram's actual account it says, quote, "The excrement was examined and found to be literally full of pins and needles." Whoa, are you telling me she pooped them?
Thank you, Vincent, for responding like a 12-year-old.
Yes, Vinny, if the accounts are true, it was a painful number 2.
Now you're both acting like 12-year-olds.
I'm just trying to be true to the account. So, actual pins and needles were said to be present in Betsy's excrement. This detail has a different character than most of what we've discussed, not simply because of how it came out and came about, but because this was alleged physical evidence. This was not a voice heard through a wall, nor a sound in the dark that could be reinterpreted. These were objects. Physical objects in the hands of witnesses. Whoa, in their hands? I mean, I really hope they disinfected them first. Vinny, that's gross, but yes, I agree. I hope so too.
Good night. Would y'all grow the heck up? Y'all are unbearable.
I think I'd rather pass some pins and needles myself than listen to this guy anymore. Oh my gosh. Moving on. Thenie Thorne's daughter-in-law recalled decades later that Thenie had gathered some of those pins and needles herself and kept them for the rest of her life. That is the kind of specific, unglamorous human detail that is difficult to fabricate. People don't invent the part about keeping the pins, especially how they found them.
Hey, number 2 for brains. How do we know they even found them? How do we know they weren't planted in there?
As easy as this would have been to do, Doc, we gotta ask the big question.
Well, what question is that?
Why lie about this? Think about what you're actually asking someone to believe if this was fabricated. It's not impossible, but you're asking me to believe that someone in that household, already exhausted, already humiliated, already ground down by years of torment that their community knew about and their church couldn't fix, decided that what their situation needed was a story about a witch doctor's medicine producing pins and needles in the most undignified way possible. And this is where it gets even more creepy and interesting, because Betsy's experience with the pins and needles isn't an isolated incident. What are you talking about? It isn't something Ingram invented or embellished for dramatic effect. There is actually a specific term for this strange phenomenon in the historical and theological literature. It's called alatriophagy, the vomiting or passing of foreign objects as a symptom of bewitchment or demonic possession. Pins, needles, nails, hair, glass stones, even live animals. Whoa, what the heck, live animals? Yep, As strange as it sounds, they all show up in the record across centuries and across continents.
Stop it. Just stop it right there. You just named a phenomenon, gave it a fancy Greek label, and now you're about to tell me it shows up all over history, and therefore Betsy Bell is authenticated? I see where this is going, and I want to object before you build the whole case. Ingram was writing in 1894. He had access to earlier literature. This is exactly the kind of detail a 19th century writer lists from 16th and 17th century witchcraft accounts to make his story feel credible. It's a trope, a well-known trope, and the fact that it shows up everywhere doesn't authenticate Betsy Bell. It tells me where Ingram went shopping.
That's a fair challenge, and I want to give it the respect it deserves before I push back. Because you're right that Ingram was writing in 1894, you're right that he had access to earlier literature. You're right that the detailed pattern matches to things that appear in older accounts. All of that's true, but here's where the trope argument breaks down. A trope is a narrative convenience. It's a detail that gets recycled because it sounds right or because it fits the genre and because the audience expects it. Tropes are borrowed because they're useful fictions. What you're describing as a trope across the 16th and 17th centuries is not a trope, but a track record. Anne Gunter in England 1605 was found vomiting pins, passing them in her urine, and even ejecting them from her nose. A child in Ulster in the late 1600s was also said to be vomiting needles, pins, hair, feathers, pieces of glass, and window nails in front of Presbyterian ministers who had been called in after the doctors gave up. 30 children in Amsterdam in 1566, 30 simultaneously vomiting pins, needles, thimbles, broken glass, with doctors and exorcists and sorcerers all working the case, and none of them getting anywhere. There's a 17th century medical theological treatise called Daimona Magea. It formally codifies the vomiting or passing by stool of pins, needles, knives, live eels, hair, bones, and hooks as a diagnostic indicator of bewitchment, and cites multiple independent medical authorities in doing so. That is not one writer borrowing from another writer. That is the same phenomenon appearing in documented cases across Norway, Italy, England, Ireland, and the Netherlands across 2 centuries in front of witnesses that included physicians, ministers, and magistrates, recorded in medical literature, court records, and theological treatises.
Okay, but all that still don't answer my original objection. Ingram had access to all that literature. He could have lifted the detail from any of those sources and dropped it into the Bell account.
You're right, he could have. But here's what the argument can't account for. The pins in the Bell case were not just reported, they were handled. Thany Thorne, Betsy's closest companion through years of the haunting, gathered those pins with her own hands and kept them until she died. Her daughter, Mrs. Rawls, says she saw them herself. That is not a literary detail borrowed from a witchcraft treatise. That is a specific woman making a specific decision to hold on to physical objects for the rest of her life. You don't fabricate that part. The keeping of the pins is too unglamorous, too specific, too human to be invention.
Oh, fine. Let's say the pins were real. Let's say something was actually found. How do we know it wasn't planted? How do we know someone didn't just drop pins into the excrement and call it evidence?
Now here's where it gets genuinely interesting, because that exact question was raised inside the primary source itself, not by a skeptic writing a century later, nor by some debunker from outside the community. It was raised by Mrs. Rawls, the daughter of the woman who gathered the pins. She says in her account, and I'm quoting Ingram directly here,
"The only solution of the matter was that the witch dropped the pins and needles in the excrement unobserved, just as it pulled off her shoes, disheveled her hair, gave her and her mother hazelnuts, and many other miraculous performances that no one could account for."
Wait a minute. She's saying the witch planted them? Exactly. She's not saying the pins weren't real. She's not dismissing the account. She's saying they were real. Her mother held them in her hands, and the most reasonable explanation to them was that the entity placed them there rather than them having passed through Betsy's body.
So even the most sympathetic witnesses in this entire record thought the mechanism was suspicious?
Actually, yes, and I think that's more honest and more theologically significant than a straightforward miracle claim would have been. Because if Mrs. Rawls had said her mother believed the pins came directly from inside Betsy, that would be easier to dismiss. Instead, she accepts the physical evidence and questions the mechanism, and the mechanism she lands on is the same one the entity used everywhere else in that house. It moved things, it placed things, it dropped hazelnuts into Lucy Bell's hands from above a floor with no openings, it put a vial of unidentified liquid in a locked cupboard where the medicine had been. An entity that could do all those things could absolutely deposit pins in pin to poo without anyone seeing it happen, which means Wright's objection that the pins might have been planted is actually answered not by dismissing the question but by taking it seriously. Yes, they may well have been planted by the entity itself, deliberately for an audience, and we already talked about why.
You're going to say the Kate Batts connection?
The Kate Batts connection. Pins were already the specific object associated with Kate Batts in the community's mind. Her habit of collecting brass pins from every woman she met had already been interpreted as evidence of witchcraft. People kept their pins away from her when she came visiting, so when pins appeared in Betsy's boo after the witch doctor's treatment, what landed in the minds of every witness in that room was confirmation. The pins pointed directly at the named suspect while simultaneously making the witch doctor look effective. That is not coincidence, that is strategy in my opinion. So yes, Ingram could theoretically have borrowed this detail from earlier literature, but the earlier literature isn't a drawer full of convenient fictions he was raiding. It's a body of documentation that was itself trying to account for something that kept happening. The 16th and 17th centuries don't give us a trope, they give us a track record, and Betsy Bell fits inside of it one way or another. I don't think this is a lie you tell if you're trying to be believed in 19th century Tennessee. This is not the detail you invent if you're trying to protect your family's dignity. The Bells were a respected Christian family. John Bell was a church elder. People who fabricate supernatural experiences to gain sympathy reach for dramatic voices and flying furniture and even ghastly apparitions. They don't reach for something that would make their teenage daughter the subject of crude jokes in Robertson County for the rest of her life. We said last week that embarrassing details don't often get invented. We said it about the Jackson account, and I think it applies here too. This unflattering detail survived because nobody would construct it, and the woman whose mother held the evidence in her hands didn't explain it away. She just asked the right question about it and landed on the same answer the rest of the record points toward. But here's what I actually want you to chew on, because we've moved through the evidential questions. Were the pins real? Were they planted? What was the mechanism? And we've established that even the most credible witness inside the primary record asked those same questions and landed on the entity as the most reasonable explanation. But there's a more important question underneath all of that, which the evidential debate tends to obscure.
Which is what?
What did the witch doctor's treatment actually accomplish? Not evidentially nor mechanically, but strategically, what did it accomplish? Because if we accept what the record describes, and I want to be careful here because this is where the account gets thinner, the treatment appeared to produce a result. Something appeared. The family witnessed it. As mentioned, Theanie Thorne gathered the evidence with her own hands and kept it until she died, and the surface reading of that result is obvious. Well, yeah, the witch doctor did something, right? He had some kind of ability. That's the answer most people might land on, and I think it's exactly the wrong conclusion and possibly the most dangerous one. What are you talking about? Because we've already established what the Bible says about occult methods. Deuteronomy 18 doesn't say these practices weren't real, it says they're forbidden. There's a significant difference between those two statements that we've examined from multiple angles on this show multiple times. The prohibition isn't based on the practices not working. It's based on what they connect you to when they do. So if the witch doctor's treatment produced a visible physical result, the question isn't whether his methods had power. The question is where that power came from. And the question underneath that one is harder still. We're dealing with an entity that had already demonstrated it could calibrate everything it did. It let Solomon Mize work for 3 days before it said a word. It waited until he had fully committed himself and then dismantled him in front of many witnesses. It performed defeat for audiences. It chose its moments deliberately. So when some unnamed witch doctor shows up with a treatment and something appears to work, I want you to ask yourself a serious question. Was that outcome the witch doctor's doing? Or did something in that house decide it was tactically useful to let him have a partial win? Wait a minute. You're saying the entity let it happen? I'm saying that an entity intelligent enough to track Andrew Jackson's approach on a public road, to repeat private conversations held behind closed doors, to name the specific ingredients supposedly missing from Solomon Mize's charm mixture, that entity was not threatened by a nameless witch doctor's concoction. If something happened that looked like success, it looked like success because something allowed it to. And now we have Mrs. Rawls' account sitting right alongside that reading, because she already told us the pins were most likely placed there by the entity unobserved. That was her explanation, not a modern debunker. The daughter of the woman who held the pins, remember, she accepted the physical evidence and concluded the entity deposited them, which means the witch doctor's treatment didn't extract them from Betsy, it gave the entity an opportunity to perform.
That's a disturbing reframe.
It gets more disturbing, because what does a partial win tell a desperate family that has run out of legitimate options? It tells them the door they just walked through is the right one. It tells them to keep going in that direction. It tells them the kingdom of darkness has tools that the church apparently did not. That is not relief, folks. That is a longer leash.
That's a genuinely unsettling read.
It's the most unsettling thing in this entire account to me so far. Not the pins themselves, not the physical evidence, but the possibility that the apparent success of the witch doctor was in fact the point. Because remember, John Bell was still dying. Nothing changed for John. Heck, nothing really changed for Betsy either. Even after the pins, the entity tormented her. It did so until after her father's death. The conjurer came and went, the witch doctor came and went, Betsy was still haunted by its presence, and John Bell continued his slow, targeted, deliberate destruction right up until December 20th, 1820. The only question that was ever actually on the table was John Bell's life, and on that question, every occult intervention produced exactly nothing. Now here's the final piece of this. We already said it, but I want to name it plainly here because it connects everything. Who were the pins associated with in Robertson County?
Oh, Kate Batts.
Yes, Kate Batts. Her habit of collecting brass pins from every woman she met had already been read by the community as evidence of witchcraft. People kept their pins away from her when she came around. The community had already constructed a narrative in which Kate Batts collected pins for dark intentions. So when the witch doctor's treatment produces pins and Betsy's excrement, what lands in the minds of every witness in that room? Well, confirmation, right? The diagnosis appears validated, the named suspect appears implicated, and the witch doctor appears competent. All three outcomes serve the entity. None of them serve the Bells. And then the entity commended him for it. That commendation is the tell, I think. An entity that had routed every other practitioner with open contempt suddenly praised this one. The only intervention that received any positive acknowledgement from the entity was the one that produced physical evidence reinforcing its own cover story. I don't think that's coincident. I think it is strategy. The entity wasn't threatened by the witch doctor. It used him. It allowed his treatments to produce a result that served its own narrative, physical evidence pointing at Kate Batts, apparent validation of occult methods, and a commendation that would encourage the family to keep going in that direction, rather than turning back toward legitimate spiritual authority. The apparent success wasn't the witch doctor's victory, it was the entity's. The pins were not evidence of a curse being broken. They were the entity staging a performance while a desperate family mistook the audience for a rescue, and then it laughed. It told the witch doctor he was the only conjurer who had actually done a good job, that he'd made Betsy expel enough pins and needles to supply the whole community, that if he gave her another dose, he could set up a store in the community. A girl who said she would drink enough poison to be free of it had been made violently ill, and the entity's response was to joke about it. That tells you everything you need to know about how threatened it actually was. When desperate people reach toward the kingdom of darkness for relief from the kingdom of darkness, they do not find relief. They find bondage. They find the thing they were trying to escape waiting for them on the other side of the door they just opened. The witch doctor's methods didn't free Betsy. They gave the entity another performance, another audience, another moment to demonstrate that nothing operating in its territory was going to outmaneuver it. And Betsy went right back to being tormented. The pins came out, and nothing changed. Because the only question that was ever on the table, again, was John Bell's life, and on that question the witch doctor, like every other practitioner before him, produced nothing at all. Now, changing gears, there is a moment in this record that the analysis has been building toward without naming it directly, and it arrives not through John Bell, not through Betsy, not through any of the investigators or conjurers or generals. It arrives through Esther Bell, one of Betsy's older sisters, on an ordinary afternoon going out to gather eggs. She saw a woman approaching the property. Nothing unusual about that. She called out in greeting. No response. She called again. Still nothing. The woman stopped just beyond the yard, removed her bonnet, let her hair down, and began running her fingers through it, slowly at first, then faster. Then, with the intensity that had nothing ordinary left in it, pulling at her hair, working through it with increasing urgency, preoccupied with something that couldn't be seen or named. Esther tried to speak to her again, even invited her inside. The woman gave no sign that she heard anything at all. It wasn't that she ignored Esther. It was as if Esther wasn't there at all. Esther went inside and brought Betsy to the window. The two of them watched as the woman climbed onto the yard fence and sat there, continuing the same strange, repetitive motion. Then she moved toward the stable lot, and as she passed behind a fallen log, 3 more figures appeared beside her, 2 young girls and a small boy. They had not approached from any direction. One moment there was only the woman, the next there were 4 entities. They climbed onto the saplings near the log and began to sway together, the trees bending under their weight in a slow, unnatural rhythm. And then Bennett Porter arrived, Esther Bell's husband, John Bell's son-in-law. Esther and Betsy called to him, "Call him over and point." He looks to see where they're pointing. He sees the sapling moving, but he doesn't see the figures. To him, it appears as though the trees are swaying for no reason at all. Wait a minute. 2 people standing at the same window seeing different things? 2 people standing at essentially the same vantage point. One seeing 4 figures, one sees moving trees and nothing more. That is not a question of attention or positioning. That is selective visibility. The manifestation was apparently choosing who could perceive it and who could not. That raises a question I don't have a clean answer for. Why could Esther and Betsy see it but not Porter? I don't have a clean answer either, but I don't think Scripture leaves us without a framework for it. The consistent principle across the biblical record is that spiritual perception is not uniformly distributed. It's not a function of proximity or attention or even belief. It appears to be something that can be opened and closed, granted and withheld by forces beyond human control.
Now wait a minute, that ain't in the Bible.
Yes, it is, and the examples aren't obscure. Many times we've already touched upon the most obvious one, Elisha's servant in 2 Kings 6. He couldn't see the heavenly armies of God surrounding them until Elisha prayed that his eyes would be opened, and there they were. Numbers 22, Balaam was a pagan prophet, a man with a documented history of genuine spiritual encounter, and his donkey sees the angel of the Lord standing in the road with a drawn sword before Balaam sees anything at all. The animal perceived what the prophet didn't. 3 times the donkey responded to what was right in front of them. 3 times Balaam saw nothing. Only after the Lord specifically opened Balaam's eyes did he see what had been visible to his animal the whole time. Same road, same moment. The donkey saw it. The prophet didn't. Daniel chapter 10. Daniel receives a vision of overwhelming intensity, but the men with him don't see the vision. What they experience instead is a great terror, an overwhelming dread with no visible source, and they flee and hide. They perceived something, but not what Daniel perceived. Same location, same event, radically different levels of access to what was actually present. In the New Testament, we have Acts 9. On the Damascus road, the men traveling with Saul of Tarsus hear the sound but see no one. Saul sees the light and hears the voice clearly enough to hold a full conversation with the risen Christ. Same road, same moment. One man's life is permanently altered by what he perceives. The men beside him experience something they cannot account for and see nothing at all. Lastly, we have Luke 24. The disciples on the road to Emmaus walked with the risen Christ but didn't recognize him until the moment he chose to be recognized. Whoa, so this ain't some weird anomaly or something. The Bible documents this sort of thing happening repeatedly. Repeatedly, Vinny. Across different contexts, different people, different kinds of spiritual encounters, this pattern is consistent enough that it has to be treated as a principle rather than an exception. Spiritual perception in Scripture is consistently portrayed as something that can be opened and closed, granted and withheld by forces beyond human control. Sometimes God opens eyes, sometimes he doesn't, and apparently sometimes the entity being perceived makes that choice itself. So you think the entity here was controlling who could see it and who couldn't? Perhaps. We can't know for certain, but that appears to be what the account describes. And the implication is significant. It wasn't performing for everyone. It was performing for specific people. Esther and Betsy were the intended audience. Porter apparently was not.
Now what kind of sense does that make?
Look, I can't pretend to know the motives of this thing with certainty, but consider what we've already established. This was a godly, respected family, a church elder and his household, a pillar of a newly planted Christian community on the American frontier. If there is a strategic interest in destroying or discrediting that kind of family, there is also a strategic interest in controlling the narrative around what is happening to them. Choosing who sees what is part of that control. Even dividing a household falls within the agenda of the kingdom of darkness. Esther sees enough stuff that her husband can't, He may conclude that she has advanced perception of some kind, or he might just conclude his bride is nuts. In any case, on this occasion, Bennett fired away, and that night something changed that hadn't changed in all the years leading up to it. The single voice became many. Oh yeah, that's right, the black dog, mathematics, psiphography in Jerusalem, right? 4 distinct voices, separate personalities, arguing with each other, mocking each other, cursing in tones witnesses described as sharper and more chaotic than anything heard before. Ingram documents this directly in Richard William Bell's account in Chapter 8, though the names are slightly different from what you said and from what I said in our narrative the first week. The 4 entities are named as Black Dog, Mathematics, Psiphography, and Jerusalem. So psiphography is close, but the text renders it as psiphography. This was not a neighbor's recollection gathered decades later. This is said to have come from Richard William Bell's own manuscript written by a man who was a child in that house during these events, as primary as the record gets.
So what exactly does he say about them?
He describes them as a witch family, 4 distinct voices that appear after the faux Kate had already established herself as the dominant presence in the home, and the voices were genuinely distinct. The entity calling itself Black Dog spoke in a harsh feminine tone and functioned as the head of the family. Mathematics and Psiphography both spoke in more delicate feminine tones but were different from each other. And the last one, Jerusalem, spoke like a boy. Their appearances were described as opening like a drunken carousal, singing, then quarreling, obscene language, blasphemous oaths, compared to the noise of a group of drunken men fighting. Black Dog would then emerge as peacemaker, denouncing the others with vehemence and threats of murder, and apparently thrashing Jerusalem for disobeying orders. At times all 4 appeared drunk simultaneously, fuming the house with the scent of whiskey, claiming they had gotten it from John Gardner's still house 4 miles away. But here is what makes this theologically significant, rather than just weird. These same 4 entities, on other occasions, would shift entirely and perform what Williams Bell describes as a regular concert of rich feminine voices, modulated to the sweetest cadence and intonation, singing any hymn called for with solemnity and wonderful effect. The same presences that were fuming the house with whiskey and brawling were also capable of producing worship music that moved people to tears. That is not random chaos, friends. That is the same deceptive range we discussed last week from 2 Corinthians 11. The enemy disguised as the angel of light, the roaring lion, not different entities, they are different modes of the same one. What happened to the 4 of them? According to Williams Bell, though he offers no timeline, he said the carousals didn't continue long. After they suspended, the 4 apparently never appeared together again as a group. From that point, it was plain old Kate who resumed, assuming all personalities, good and bad, as she had before. But here's what that progression actually looks like when you lay it out. It began as one presence, it developed 4 distinct personalities with distinct voices, then collapsed back into one. Like they merged back together or something? Or like the multiplication served its purpose and was no longer necessary. Because that progression maps directly onto what we discussed from Matthew 12, the unclean spirit returning with others more wicked than itself. The house was not getting better during this period, it was getting more populated. And the entity had already told the family directly that it would follow John Bell to the remotest part of the earth. There was no geographic solution to something that had apparently multiplied its presence within the same location. Ain't there one more detail you're forgetting about? What's that, Vinny? The 4th one, the Jerusalem guy. Ain't he the one that Bennett Porter shot during the incident? Oh yeah, when Porter fired at the apparitions in the stable lot directed by the Bell sisters, who could see something he could not, the entity returned that night and declared to everyone assembled that Porter had shot Jerusalem and broken his arm with a bullet. Wait a minute, Ray. What are we supposed to do with that? Did he have silver bullets or something? I think it was all part of the charade, Vinny. Whether 1 entity or 5, no spirits were harmed in the making of this episode, or from any of the bullets in Porter's rifle. I want to go to Mark 5 for one final thought on all of this. When Jesus encounters the demoniac at the Gadarenes and asks his name, the answer was Legion. For we are many, it declared. The presence of multiple entities operating within or through a single locus with distinct personalities and apparent hierarchies is not a novel concept in the Bible. What the Bell Farm accounts describe in this period, a dominant voice, ordering lesser ones, personalities with names, arguments about precedence and territory, this all maps uncomfortably well onto what the Gospels show us about the kingdom of darkness and how it actually organizes itself. So what you're saying is there was more than one entity involved? I'm suggesting the 4 voices appeared because something slipped. My read on this, and I want to be clear this is my theological interpretation rather than something the record states directly, is that more than one entity was present on that farm from the very beginning. Not from the moment the four voices emerged, but from the start. What Bennett Porter's shot precipitated wasn't a multiplication, it was a disclosure. Think about everything we already documented about how this thing operated. The calibrated performances, the controlled reveals, the strategic timing, the deliberate choice of who could see what and when. This was not a presence that did anything accidentally, and yet here, after years of presenting as a single unified voice with a single identity, suddenly there are four distinct vocal characters, four distinct personalities, a hierarchy, internal conflicts, arguments about precedence. That does not happen because a single spirit had an unusual evening. That is a population revealing itself, I think.
And you think they was always there?
I think they were always there, and the single Kate voice was the mask they chose to wear most often. One identity, one name, one folkloric label to carry the load and for the community to attach to what was happening and feel like they understood it. And then something in the chaos of that moment, the shot, the confrontation in the stable lot, the sudden shift in the household's energy, something caused the mask to slip, not fall off entirely. I just think it slipped. They tipped their hand too far. Four voices emerged where one had been, and then, according to Williams Bell, after a period he describes only as not long, they resembled behind the mask, and Kate resumed as if the other phase had never happened.
Like they caught themselves?
Like they caught themselves, or like the disclosure had served whatever purpose it needed to serve, and the unified presentation was no longer worth maintaining for that moment, but was worth resuming afterward. Either way, the four voices aren't the anomaly in this record. They're the one moment where what was actually there became briefly visible. Everything else, the single voice, the unified identity, the folklore name, that's the performance. I think the four voices are the truth that slipped through, or at least part of it. Cause additional confusion, stir up additional strife, then disappear. Without explanation, without transition, the multiple voices disappeared and the single identity returned as if the other phase had never happened.
Now wait a minute. You still forgot one more detail.
What is it this time?
The whiskey detail. What's going on with that?
Ah, yes, there are accounts from this period of the voices sounding intoxicated and the house filled with the smell of whiskey, the whole display veering into something almost absurd.
Almost absurd. No, sir, all of it's absurd.
Not helpful, Doc.
Oh, come on, you don't actually believe this thing emitted a smell.
The connection between foul odors and alleged demonic activity has a long history in Christian and folkloric tradition. Across centuries of exorcism accounts, monastic writings, hagiographies, and supernatural folklore, witnesses frequently described unnatural stenches associated with oppressive spiritual encounters. Sulfur, rot, decay, and burning odors became especially tied to infernal imagery because of the biblical associations with brimstone and divine judgment. While the Bell Witch's reported whiskey smell is unusual compared to the more common sulfur motif, anomalous odors themselves are a recurring feature in historical haunting narratives.
Now, I know that ain't in the Bible.
The biblical text does not give us a detailed taxonomy of demonic smells directly, but it gives us enough to work with theologically. Revelation 9 describes locusts emerging from the smoke of the bottomless pit, and the pit itself is described in terms of smoke and darkness. The association between the abyss and a kind of atmospheric corruption runs throughout the apocalyptic literature. More directly useful is the physicality of demonic presence throughout the gospel accounts. When Jesus casts out Legion in Mark 5, the spirits immediately seek physical embodiment in the pigs, who then destroy themselves. The demonic in Scripture consistently seeks physical expression and physical interaction with the material world.
Okay, but shut up. What does any of that got to do with smell?
Smell is one of the most primal and instinctive of the physical senses, and an entity that interacts with physical space, knocking, producing physical sensations like the slaps and pinches documented throughout the Bell case, is an entity operating in the physical register. A strange smell is consistent with that pattern of physical engagement, and if spiritual entities can do all the other things, why would producing a smell even be an issue?
You know what? I think I figured it out. I think I know where the whiskey smell came from. Maybe everyone was drunk the whole time, the whole village, and that's why the whole thing happened in the first place. Everybody was just getting tipsy all the time.
Now you're just being a troll, Doc. In my opinion, nobody inventing a demonic haunting for credibility purposes invents the part where the demons smell like whiskey and act drunk. That detail has the texture of something that was actually experienced and reported faithfully, precisely because it was too strange to leave out. But you are all free to disagree.
All this talk of smells associated with the Bell farm actually made me remember something we touched upon previously about a different Porter, the guy named William Porter. Did he smell of something? No, not quite, Vinny. Did he have any relation to Bennett Porter? Based on what Ingram provides, I can't establish a documented family relationship between Bennett Porter and William Porter for sure. The Porter name being shared suggests they could have been related, possibly brothers or cousins, given that they appear to have been part of the same social circle in a tight-knit frontier community where families intermarried extensively. Ingram establishes early on in the book that the Bell neighborhood was composed of a relatively small number of prominent families who were all on intimate terms, intermarried, and moved in the same circles. The Porters are listed among those founding families. Ingram also tells us clearly that Bennett Porter married Esther Bell, making him John Bell's son-in-law, as we noted previously. William Porter is identified as a prominent citizen of the community, a gentleman of high integrity, a good friend of the Bell family who spent many nights there during the Trouble. Ingram describes him as a bachelor occupying his own house alone when he has his own unfortunate encounter. One cold night, he came home to find his fire already lit and his bed not empty. The covers were slowly shifting as if something unseen had settled into them. And then a voice spoke.
Billy, I've come to sleep with you and keep you warm.
This is a different kind of intrusion than anything else in the record. Everything else the entity did was typically loud, performative, and designed for an audience. But this was quiet. Domestic, even intimate. Something that had let itself into a man's home, lit his fire, and gotten into his bed, then waited for him. I think I remember this guy from a few weeks ago. Didn't he try and burn it or something? Yes, he tried to burn it, and I don't blame him either. He felt something moving across the bed, sliding like a snake, according to his account, displacing the blankets as it moved. He grabbed the bundled sheets and dragged them toward the fireplace, and as he did, the weight became heavier than it should have been, and the smell that came off it was overwhelming, something foul and unnatural that forced him back. So it had physical weight that it seemingly could alter at will. It displaced blankets, so it interacted with the physical space, slithering like a snake no less, and it produced a foul odor smell. This fits more firmly within the smells associated with other hauntings. The snake imagery Porter himself uses is interesting. This, of course, is the oldest image in the biblical record for the presence of evil in intimate space. Genesis 3 does not describe Satan arriving with thunder and declaration. He arrives in the garden, in the place of habitation, in the space where the human being lives and tends and rests. And he speaks quietly, personally, in a way designed to create a sense of familiarity and trust. What the entity did to William Porter follows a similar pattern. It did not announce itself from the road. It did not perform for an audience. It entered his private space, his habitation, made itself at home in it, and waited for him. And when Porter reached for it, the physicality shifted, the weight changed, the foul smell emerged. The smell that drove Porter back from the fire is one of the moments where the concealment slipped. He grabbed it. He felt the weight change, and then something beneath the performance surfaced in a way that bypassed all the intellectual and emotional defenses the entity had been carefully cultivating, not through argument or theology or discernment, through smell. The most ancient and instinctive of the senses, the one most directly connected to the limbic system, the one least susceptible to being reasoned around. Porter did not decide the smell was bad. He experienced it as overwhelming, and he fled. That involuntary physical recoil is itself significant. The body recognized something the mind might have been persuaded to rationalize. The smell is the moment the mask came off, not through theological argument nor through prayer, not through confrontation, but through physical contact with what was actually there beneath everything the entity had been presenting to the community for years, and Porter could not hold on to it. All of this points towards something with genuine physical presence, or at minimum the capacity to interact with the physical world in ways that go way beyond sound and suggestion. But it didn't stick around, did it? It did not, and neither did Porter. He dropped the bundle and left the room, and when he came back, the bed was empty, the covers lay where they had fallen, whatever had been there was now gone. As I touched on last week, many of the phenomena associated with the Bell Witch share Lilith parallels. The night, the vulnerability of Porter being alone, and then the seduction element to boot. We covered this in part 2, so I'll keep it brief, but the profile that emerges from the Second Temple tradition around these entities is specific enough to be worth naming again here. Consistently feminine in character, ancient beyond measure, knowledgeable about human beings in a way that suggests they were present long ago, deeply familiar with human vulnerability, not just physically but emotionally, psychologically and relationally. And across the entire Bell haunting, every one of those characteristics is present. Through the carousals and the blasphemous oaths and the drunken voices and the violence, the primary entity presented was usually feminine, Jerusalem being the only exception. The targeting of Betsy's breathing we covered last week in connection with ancient wind spirits sharing etymology with Lilith. Pastor Michael Miller shared with me how he encountered a Lilith-like entity that was specifically obstructing a woman's breathing. When he rebuked that spirit by name, the breathing was restored. The smothering episodes Betsy experienced, the shortness of breath, the loss of consciousness, those fit the same pattern with uncomfortable specificity. Attacking the vulnerable follows the historic record. Betsy was a major focal point. She was the youngest, the most exposed, the one whose suffering would land most directly on a father who could do nothing to stop it. She was useful precisely because she was vulnerable. And Lucy was treated with warmth, not because the entity loved her or liked her, but because the Lilith tradition consistently shows something that reserves a particular kind of regard for mothers while destroying what belongs to them. There is a reading of that tradition not universally held, but present across multiple ancient sources that connects this behavior to loss. That what targets the children of others does so because its own may have been taken. That the warmth toward the mother and the cruelty toward the child came from the same wound. I gotta ask, is this where you're leaning toward in all of this? I can't say with certainty that that is what was operating in that house, but the pattern fits in ways I find difficult to dismiss. Then there's the singing, of course. The singing is one of the details that gets treated as local color in most retellings of this case, and I think that's a mistake. This entity sang constantly. It sometimes sang hymns with a voice witnesses described as more beautiful than any human voice they had ever heard. It sang drinking songs at John Bell's funeral while his family stood over his grave. It sang lullabies and worship songs to Lucy Bell during her illness with a tenderness that made grown men turn away to hide their tears. And that detail, the singing, the quality of the voice, the range of what it chose to sing and when, fits the siren framework in a way that goes beyond coincidence. I recently retoasted the siren in Lilith episodes. The siren tradition across cultures is not primarily about danger. It is about beauty deployed as a weapon, the voice that draws you in before you understand what you are moving toward. Homer's sirens don't attack ships, they sing, and the singing is the mechanism by which sailors who know the danger still find themselves staring toward the rocks. An entity that can sing hymns with heartbreaking beauty and then sing drinking songs over a dead man's grave while his children weep is not expressing contradiction. It is demonstrating its range. It's showing you it can reach you wherever you are in your worship, in your grief, in your private moments of rest, and that the beauty of what it offers you is not evidence that it means you well. The voice that moved Lucy Bell to tears during her illness was the same voice that announced with joy it had poisoned her husband in his sleep. Same entity, same voice, different performance for a different audience. That is not a ghost rattling pipes. That is something that understands music the way a predator understands terrain. It knows where the current runs, and it knows how to use it. The longer I spent with this case, the more it all fit together, though not everything fits, so maybe we're not dealing with either or, but and. In and out of the Bible, Lilith is never alone anyway. Neither are sirens. They're always accompanied by a plethora of other spiritual nasties, so it would make sense that multiple entities were at work on the Bell farm, and the title, The Bell Witch, is the perfect mask for what was really going on. And I want to connect that back to something we established earlier, the entity's own claim about itself. When pressed about its nature, it said it lived in heaven and in hell and in the earth, in the air, in houses, in people, that it could be in any place at any time and assume any form it desired. Now I want to push back on how that claim has been read, because that statement has been treated as evidence of omnipresence, as if whatever was in that house was everywhere at once the way God is everywhere at once. But that is blasphemous. Only Yahweh, the Creator God, is omnipresent. That is not an attribute that transfers to created beings, fallen or otherwise. No demon, no principality, no power described anywhere in Scripture possesses genuine omnipresence, but Him. That is an incommunicable attribute of God alone, so what do we do with a claim that sounds like omnipresence coming from something that is definitionally not omnipresent? You ask whether it is a lie dressed up as a boast. Or more precisely, you ask whether it is a coordinated deception produced by multiple entities working together in a way designed to give the impression of omnipresence without actually possessing it.
You're saying it ain't one thing then?
I am saying the record itself tells us it wasn't one thing if we are willing to read it carefully. We documented earlier that the entity presented as one voice, then fractured into 4 distinct voices with 4 distinct personalities and what Ingram described as 4 distinct vocal characters, and then collapsed back into one. That is not one entity having a bad night. That is a structure revealing itself before reassembling the mask. And when you have multiple entities operating in coordinated fashion across a single location, each capable of independent action, you get something that functionally resembles omnipresence to the people living inside it. One entity quoting scripture in the front room while another fumes the house with whiskey. One entity singing hymns to Lucy Bell while another gets into William Porter's bed. One entity tracking John Bell across the farm, while another monitors visitors coming down the lane. One entity can be reporting on events 4 miles away at Gardner's Still House, while another intercepts Drew Bell and James Johnson 20 miles down the road. That is not omnipresence. That is a coordinated operation with distributed presence, and the Bell family living inside it all with no theological framework to account for what they were experiencing, the difference would have been completely invisible. So when it said it was everywhere, it was basically telling on itself? It was telling on itself, and nobody in that room had the framework to hear what it was actually saying. What it described was not the nature of God, it was the nature of a kingdom. Paul gives us the exact language in Ephesians 6, principalities, powers, rulers of darkness, spiritual wickedness in high places. Not a single entity with a single location, but a hierarchy, a structure with range and coordination and the capacity to operate across multiple registers simultaneously. That is what the boast actually describes when you strip the pretense of omnipresence away from it. Not I am everywhere, but we are many, and we are organized, and you cannot tell where one of us ends and another begins, which I think is exactly what Isaiah 34 shows us. Isaiah 34 is one of the most uncomfortable passages in the whole Old Testament precisely because of what it describes inhabiting desolate places. Howling creatures, sirens, goat demons, and Lilith sandwiched in between it all, the night creature, the one who finds her rest there. She is not alone in that text. She is surrounded by a company of other demonic creatures that inhabit the same desolate space. That is the consistent picture wherever this figure appears in the broader tradition. She is not a solitary entity. She operates with a retinue. She is always accompanied by what the tradition describes as a company of other spiritual presences. So when I look at the Porter incident, the intimacy of it, the domesticity of it, the snake imagery, the night, the vulnerability of a man alone, and I place that alongside Black Dog, mathematics, and psychography in Jerusalem, and the 4 voices, the carousals, the coordinated surveillance, the distributed presence across the Bell property and the surrounding community, I am not looking at one thing wearing many masks. I am looking at many things sharing one mask. The Bell Witch. The title, The Bell Witch, is the perfect cover for what the record actually describes. Singular, female, local, folkloric, a name that makes the whole thing sound like a neighborhood problem rather than what it actually was. A coordinated incursion by multiple entities operating under a unified purpose with a single designated target, and the theological sophistication to conceal their true number and nature from everyone in that house for years. Which makes the whole record more dangerous to engage with, not less, I think. A voice in a wall can be rationalized. A smell and a weight and a presence in your bed that you cannot burn already requires a different kind of reckoning. But a coordinated operation for years by multiple entities masquerading as a single local witch requires a completely different order of spiritual awareness than anyone in Robertson County in 1817 was equipped to bring to bear. They did not know what they were dealing with. They named it Kate. They invited their neighbors to come hear it talk. They brought it conjurers and witch doctors and men with silver bullets, and what they were actually hosting was perhaps something more, something with hierarchy and range and distributed presence and a unified purpose that none of their attempted solutions were even aimed at correctly. The Bell family never got the reckoning the situation required. They got folklore. They got spectacle. They got occult practitioners who made everything worse, in my opinion. They never got anyone who walked in there understanding what was actually there and carrying the authority the gospel accounts describe. And whatever was in that house knew that. It counted on it. It may have engineered it. That is why it stayed as long as it did, and why it did what it did to John Bell. And that is why when it finally left, it left on its own terms, announcing a return date, which, according to the record, it kept.
Okay, so we got ancient demons, a night spirit from Isaiah, a whole coordinated supernatural task force, and they all decided that the most pressing item on their agenda was a tobacco farm in Robertson County, Tennessee. That's what we're going with here?
I mean, he does have a point, Toast the Boy. Why Robertson County, after all? Why the Bells? Those are fair questions, and I don't like it when you two agree, but they deserve serious answers. Let me start with what we can document and work outward from there. The land itself has a history that predates John Bell by thousands of years. Archaeological evidence confirms that the region around the Bell Farm along the Red River was inhabited by woodland and Mississippian cultures from approximately 750 AD through 1500 AD. These were mound-building peoples. They constructed burial mounds for their elite dead throughout this region of Middle Tennessee. The bluff directly above what is now known as the Bell Witch Cave has been examined by archaeologists who estimated the graves there to be between 3,000 and 5,000 years old. The remains were buried sitting upright facing east, consistent with what is believed to be Chickasaw burial practice. Additional burials have been found on the plain above the cave entrance. That cave sits on the Bell Farm property, and someone disturbed those graves. Ingram documents this in Richard William Bell's own account. Farmhands clearing land discovered a small mound of graves. A young man named Corbin Hall proposed opening one to look for relics. Drew Bell agreed. They disinterred the bones. Hall brought a jawbone to the house, threw it against a wall while sitting in the hallway, knocked out a tooth, which dropped through a crack in the floor. John Bell came through, reprimanded them severely, had the bones replaced and the grave filled in, and then the entity, when pressed about its origin, gave one of its earliest explanations as being the spirit of a person whose grave had been disturbed, whose bones had been scattered, who was looking for a lost tooth. Now, we established that the entity lied constantly and changed its story repeatedly, so I'm not pressing that as the explanation. The entity said many things about its origins that contradicted each other, but the desecration happened. That is documented. The graves were there, they were disturbed, and the timing of that disturbance relative to the onset of the phenomena is part of the record.
So after all that, after the exegesis and the Greek words and the blah blah taxonomy of demonic behavior and the Isaiah 34 deep dive, after all that, the explanation is Indian burial ground. We landed on Indian burial ground. I think Steven Spielberg made that movie in 1982. You know that, right?
The reason it is a trope is because it kept happening. Horror filmmakers did not invent the idea of desecrated burial ground unleashing darkness. I think they inherited it. They drew from a well of documented accounts stretching back centuries across multiple continents and multiple cultures that all arrived at the same conclusion independently. When a pattern shows up that consistently across that many unconnected sources, you have two choices. You can call it a trope and dismiss it, or you can ask why the pattern exists in the first place. You're arguing that the reason this narrative appears so consistently in horror fiction is because horror writers are unoriginal, not because the pattern reflects something real that people across centuries kept encountering and kept trying to describe. The Cherokee did not read Poltergeist, Dr. Wright. The Chickasaw did not get their understanding of sacred ground from a Steven Spielberg film. The indigenous peoples of this continent developed elaborate protocols around burial sites and the spiritual significance of certain locations completely independently of Western horror culture. And those protocols were not superstition dressed up as religion. They were accumulated wisdom about what happens when you treat certain places carelessly. John Bell did not treat those graves carelessly because he was a bad man. He treated them carelessly because he had no framework to understand what he was standing on. He came from a tradition that had largely lost its own understanding of how the spiritual and physical worlds intersect in specific locations. And he built his farm on ground that people who understood that intersection had specifically marked as requiring careful handling for thousands of years. Now here's the part that matters theologically. I'm not arguing that the Cherokee burial ground caused the Bell haunting the way a broken gas line causes a fire. I'm not arguing for a mechanistic relationship between desecrated graves and demonic activity. What I'm arguing is that the land had a history of spiritual significance, to use a Ghostbusties term, spiritual turbulence, a history of careful stewardship by people who understood something about that location that John Bell did not. A history that included the violent displacement of those people and the careless disturbance of their dead. And into that specific location, with that specific history, came a family that represented exactly the kind of target the Kingdom of Darkness has strategic interest in destroying. The land did not summon the darkness, but a location with a compromised history and a desecrated boundary on a frontier where the Church of Jesus Christ was being newly planted in territory that had just been violently cleared of its previous inhabitants. That is not a random target, that is a specific convergence of factors that any serious student of spiritual warfare should find significant. The reason it became a trope is because it is true often enough that storytellers kept reaching for it. Dr. Wright's job is to call it a trope. My job is to ask why the trope exists, and the answer to that question is considerably more unsettling than the trope itself. I am saying the land had a history of use as a site of spiritual significance long before John Bell arrived. I am saying that history included burial practices that were themselves connected to spiritual cosmologies we don't fully understand. I'm saying the physical desecration of those graves is documented in the primary record, and I'm saying that the entity itself referenced that desecration in one of its earliest self-identifications. Again, I am not saying that this was a Cherokee or Chickasaw spirit that became the Bell Witch, because the behavior in that house does not fit the profile of a disturbed ancestral spirit seeking rest. Disturbed ancestral spirits in virtually every indigenous tradition are understood as confused or disoriented, seeking resolution. They don't quote scripture, they don't demonstrate sophisticated theological knowledge, nor do they coordinate surveillance across miles of territory. They also do not multiply into 4 distinct personalities with names and a hierarchy and then reassemble. They do not engineer the slow, systematic destruction of a specific individual over years while managing everyone in the household with calibrated precision. What the desecration of those graves may have done is something different. It may have opened a door, not summoned a spirit. Opened a location, like they broke a seal on something that was already there. The Cherokee understood rivers as living spiritual entities. The Red River runs directly alongside the Bell property. The cave sits at its bank. The burial ground sits above the cave. For thousands of years, that location was treated as spiritually significant by people who understood that certain places are not neutral ground, something Western Christians have forgotten. When Christian settlers arrived with no framework for that history and no understanding of what they were building on, and then disturbed the graves that marked that ground as sacred space, they did not summon something new. They may have removed a boundary that was already holding something back. But here is where I want to be careful and precise with you, because there is a second answer to Wright's question that has nothing to do with the land and everything to do with the family. Remember, John Bell was a church elder, a Baptist, a man of deep and genuine piety who Ingram describes as faithful in every duty to his family, to his church, his neighbors, and to his God. A man whose integrity was never questioned even by the entity that destroyed him. The entity and all its vile curses and threats never brought a single accusation against John Bell's character. Do you understand what that means theologically? The enemy does not primarily target the corrupt. The corrupt are already compromised. The enemy more often targets the faithful. I think of Job. Job was not targeted because he was wicked. He was targeted because he was righteous. The explicit framing of Job 1 is that an adversary presents himself before God and specifically requests permission to afflict a man described as the most blameless on earth. John Bell was a pillar of a community that was establishing Christianity on the American frontier. The Red River Baptist Church was planted there in 1791. These were not nominal Christians. These were people who built their civilization around the worship of God and the advancing of the gospel into new territory. I think that is exactly the kind of target that warrants a coordinated incursion, not because of what John Bell did, because of what he represented. Because of what that community was building, because of what the kingdom of darkness stands to lose when faithful people establish the worship of God in a new territory. So you're thinking the answer is both, the land and the man. The land provided a location with a compromised boundary and a history of spiritual turbulence that the settlers had no framework to understand or respect. The man provided a target that the kingdom of darkness had specific strategic interest in destroying, and the timing was 1817. Robertson County was barely 30 years removed from the last Indian massacres in the region. The history records that the years 1793 and 1794 closed the Indian massacres in Robertson County with killings and woundings just miles from where the Bell Farm would be established. That area was full of bloodshed, and I believe that draws these malevolent entities like flies to excrement. The frontier was still raw. The Christian community was young and newly planted. The cultural and spiritual displacement of the indigenous people who had held that land for thousands of years was recent and violent and unresolved. Into that specific location, on to land with desecrated graves and a history of sacred use and massive bloodshed, came a family who represented the leading edge of Christian civilization pushing into new territory. Wright's question was, why would powerful entities care about a silly farm in rural Tennessee? The answer is that it was not a silly farm, nor a silly family. It was a boundary, and something on the other side of that boundary decided the time to push back was 1817. This episode and this series has already gone on far too long, but before we get to John Bell's death, I want to talk about Dean. Because Dean's story is in this record, and it almost never gets the attention it deserves. And I think the reason it doesn't is the same reason a lot of things in this record get skipped over. It's uncomfortable in ways that go beyond the supernatural. Dean was enslaved. He worked the Bell Farm, and the entity that occupied that farm had already made its feelings about the enslaved workers plain. It behaved abusively and contemptuously toward the enslaved workers on the Bell property. There's a real tension in the historical record that people don't always know what to do with, because despite the entity's apparent contempt toward the enslaved workers on the Bell Farm, its behavior toward Dean tells a more complicated story. It didn't ignore him, it singled him out again and again. Dean reported encounters with it, some of the earliest in the entire case, and often in forms or manifestations that seemed distinct from what others experienced. Oh yes, the black dog. The black dog.
Now hold on there, didn't we already talk about some black dog thing?
Good catch, and it's worth distinguishing carefully because the record uses the same name for two different things. When we talked about the four voices, Black Dog was the name of one of the entities, well, at least the name it gave itself, a personality, one of the four distinct presences that emerged after the Bennett Porter incident and operated as what Williams Bell described as the head of that particular group. It spoke in a harsh feminine tone. It functioned as a kind of authority figure among the four, the one that broke up the carousals and threatened the others into order. That black dog was a name chosen by an entity to identify itself to the Bell household. It's a label or a persona, part of the same deliberate self-presentation that gave us Kate and Jerusalem and mathematics and typography or whatever. What Dean encountered was something different in kind, not a voice calling itself Black Dog, but an actual form. An actual physical manifestation that appeared to him in the road, on the path to his wife's cabin again and again, in a shape he described as a large black dog. Sometimes with one head, sometimes with two, sometimes with no head at all. That is not a personality presenting itself with a name. That is an entity choosing a specific physical form and deploying it repeatedly against a specific person in a specific context. And the form it chose is significant because Dean was moving through darkness on a rural path alone in territory where a dog appearing in the road at night is exactly the kind of thing that would register as a threat to be reckoned with rather than a supernatural event to be analyzed. It met Dean where Dean was, in the language Dean's body would respond to before his mind could intervene, not a voice through a wall or a presence in a bedroom, but a thing in the road between him and where he wanted to be. Whether the black dog that named itself to the household and the black dog that blocked Dean's path were the same entity operating in different modes or two separate presences sharing an image, the record doesn't tell us. What it tells us is that the form Dean encountered had a physicality and a persistence that the named black dog voice did not. Dean's black dog could be struck with an axe. It had weight that responded to impact. It changed shape across multiple encounters in ways that suggested it was reacting to what Dean did to it. That is more than a name. That is a presence with a body, or at least something close enough to a body that an axe could find it. Dean believed he split the dog's head with his axe during one encounter, which he held responsible for the two-headed appearance afterward. Whether that's literally what happened, or whether Dean was describing in the only language available to him something that defied easy description, the detail is consistent across his accounts. And that man kept going back out night after night with that axe. He did, and he carried it everywhere, along with something else. along with a witch ball his wife had made for him from her own hair and other materials she believed would offer him protection on those roads.
Wait a minute. Wasn't Dean's wife also named Kate?
Good job, Vinny. Yes, I didn't talk about that in our narrative episode, but yes, Dean's wife was also named Kate. Dean never remarks on the overlap, neither does Ingram.
You think that's why the witch targeted him specifically? Like it has some kind of claim on him because of the name connection?
No, I don't think that's it personally. I think that's an interesting coincidence that the record doesn't remark on, as I said, and the silence itself is telling. But I don't think a name is what drew this thing to Dean. I think what drew it to Dean was the witch ball. Think about what the witch ball actually was. It was folk magic, so-called protective folk magic made by a woman who loved him and wanted him safe, but folk magic nonetheless. The same category of practice Deuteronomy 18 names directly. The same category the entity had already demonstrated it understood better than anyone who tried to use it against the Bell household. Remember how it handled Solomon Mize last week. It demonstrated that it understood his methods more intimately than he did. I don't know Dean's full spiritual history, nor his wife, and neither does the record. What I know is that he walked that property night after night carrying objects made from hair and foxfire and fungus and camphor, believing they would protect him. And the entity found him every single time. It knew exactly which pocket the ball was in. It knew what was in it before Dean opened his mouth. It even knew the second ball Dean received from Kate had different ingredients than the first one. That's not what something looks like when it's being blocked. That's what something looks like when it's been given a reason to pay attention. The witch ball didn't keep the entity from Dean. It may have been doing quite the opposite, announcing him, marking him like Frodo when he put on the ring as someone moving through that property, carrying objects that belonged to the same spiritual territory the entity operated in. So the entity came for him the way it came for Mize, not with fear but with contempt dressed up as familiarity, again telling him exactly what he had in his pocket, correcting his methods, demonstrating that whatever Dean thought gave him an edge, the entity understood it better and had already accounted for it. And that's the thing about reaching into darkness to protect yourself from the dark. It doesn't work the way you think it's going to work. Dean's wife made that ball out of love, I'm sure, out of a genuine fear for a man she wanted to come home safe. That's not the problem, but the material it was made from, the tradition it drew on, the spiritual territory it operated within, that belonged to something else, and that something else knew it. You don't borrow the enemy's tools to fight the enemy. But each night Dean went out on that property with his axe and his witch ball, and on those nights the two-headed dog blocked his way and spoke to him, told him he couldn't pass unless he handed over the witch ball. Dean said he had no ball. As noted before, the entity told him exactly which pocket it was in. He said if it wouldn't let him pass, he'd simply go another way. He turned around. The dog was standing in front of him once again. He raised the axe, told it he'd split it open to its tail before he'd give it anything. Like John Jr., he was defiant and unbending. Though misled, he refused to surrender what he had to protect himself with. Neither of them ran, neither of them gave it what it was asking for.
Yeah, and both of them paid the price for it.
I think both of them paid a price. What happened to Dean next is one of the strangest passages in the entire record. A weakness came over him, sudden and total, like the ground had shifted under everything he thought he could rely on. His axe dropped. He couldn't stand. He dropped to his hands and knees, feeling in the dark for the handle, and then he had 4 legs. I want to be careful here because this is the part where the account becomes very difficult to evaluate. Known as the mule transformation, Dean experiencing himself as having 4 legs, a tail, ears that had changed shape, 2 figures climbing onto his back, arguing about who would sit in front. That is either the most bizarre detail in this entire record or one of the most theologically significant, and maybe it's both.
Oh my gosh, meaning you think it actually happened?
I think something happened, whether it was a literal physical transformation, a complete override of Dean's sensory experience, or something in between that we don't have adequate language for. I don't know.
So where did Dean find a mirror in the woods to see his new donkey form? And exactly how many witnesses do we have for this donkey transformation?
He didn't see himself. That's actually the point. Dean never claimed to see his own reflection. He knew he had 4 legs because he was on them. He knew he had a tail because he said something jerked on it. He knew he had ears because something grabbed them. This was a man describing his own body from the inside, in the dark, on a road he walked 100 times, and the only witnesses to what was happening were the things doing it to him. Dean's account doesn't rely on a mirror. It relies on his sensation, on what his body was doing, on the voices of entities reacting to something they could apparently see and he could only feel. And as for witnesses, we have Dean. We have Aunt Ibby, who was the one who heard his account firsthand and repeated it for Ingram decades later. What we don't have is a second person who stood on that road and watched it happen. But we also don't have a second person who stood in the room with John Bell and watched whatever killed him. We have testimony. We have a man and woman who never changed their accounts. That's the same evidentiary framework we've applied to everything else in this record. Dean says he kicked both figures over his head, cleared a fence without slowing down, ran until he reached his wife's cabin, and pawed at the door until she opened it.
Don't you mean hooved?
Shut up. When he saw her face, he says he was standing on 2 feet again. Some accounts say other farmhands recalled Dean returning from the direction of the property on multiple occasions with his clothing nearly torn from his body, looking as though he'd been thoroughly beaten. Something sounds as though it happened, and it happened more than once, according to the records. The possum hunting account ends with Dean unconscious in the woods until morning, a large bloody gash on his head, and a scar he carried for the rest of his life. He said the witch had appeared as a very large rabbit, unhappy about his hunting methods, and had hit him over the head with a stick. He never once attributed that scar to anything other than that encounter.
I think he might have taken a few knocks to the head before the stick if he's seeing talking bunnies.
Yo, it's giving me Donnie Darko vibes. Ooh, Frank the Rabbit is gross and terrifying.
What are you talking about? Who the heck is it? Frank the Rabbit? What?
It's a movie reference, Doc. Come on, get a life. Frank appears as a tall figure in a grotesque metallic rabbit suit with a distorted grin, this creepy skeletal mouth, and these dead-looking eyes. He tells Donnie the exact amount of time until the world ends.
What on earth do you two do with your time?
Anyways, this large bunny allegedly left a scar on Dean. A scar doesn't lie, and Dean doesn't read in these accounts as someone prone to invention. He was believed by the people who knew him, not because mule transformations and stick-swinging rabbits were accepted as literal facts by everyone who heard them, but because Dean was not known to invent things without cause, and because the physical corroboration was there every time he came back from the property. The major question is, what do we do theologically with the transformation account? Scripture gives us more to work with here than people expect. We've already established that spirits can inhabit animals, Matthew 8, the Gadarene swine. We've established in the past that some angelic beings have animalistic characteristics. We talked about the Nachash in the garden, Satan taking the form that was serpentine. The capacity of spiritual entities to alter or override physical experience is not a novel claim in the biblical framework, but the most direct parallel in Scripture for what Dean describes is not an animal possession account at all. It's Daniel 4. Nebuchadnezzar is the most powerful man on earth at the time, king of Babylon, builder of one of the ancient world's great civilizations, and God's judgment upon his pride takes a specific and deeply strange form. Daniel 4:33 describes it plainly. He was driven from men and ate grass like an oxen. His body was wet with the dew of heaven until his hair had grown like eagle's feathers and his nails like bird's claws. I've said it before, I do not believe that to be metaphor. The text does not present it as vision or symbol. It presents it as something that physically happened to a physical man in the physical world over a documented period of potentially 7 years. The Babylonian court witnessed it. It was recorded. Nebuchadnezzar himself later wrote about it in first person. A human being under divine judgment underwent a transformation that blurred the boundary between human and animal. Now, I want to be careful here because the mechanism in Daniel 4 is divine judgment, not demonic activity. God did this to Nebuchadnezzar as an act of judgment and humbling. I'm not arguing that what happened to Dean was the same thing. What I am arguing is simpler than that. If the biblical text presents the transformation of a human being's physical experience into something animal-like as an event that literally happened, witnessed, recorded, and later testified to by the man himself, then the category of physical transformation under spiritual influence is not outside the biblical framework. Daniel 4 establishes that the boundary between human physical experience and animal physical experience is not as fixed as we assume when we are operating purely in the natural register. Something can reach across that boundary. In Nebuchadnezzar's case, it was God reaching across it for a redemptive purpose. In Dean's account on the Bell property, it was potentially something reaching across it from the other direction. The destination in both cases has the same quality: a human being on all fours, outside in the dark, behaving like an animal, returned to themselves only when the influence withdrew. Nebuchadnezzar's reason was lifted from him and restored after 7 years when he raised his eyes toward heaven. Dean's transformation potentially broke when he got back home. Two very different encounters with two very different powers, but the same category of event, and a category the biblical text does not treat as impossible. We're approaching the final stretch, folks, but before we get to the vial and the cat and the singing at the funeral, I want to stop in the field where we began today. Because there is a moment in this record that the analysis has been circling without landing on directly, and it happens not in the house, not in front of witnesses, nor as a performance for Robertson County. It happened on a walk. A father and his son on the property John Bell had carved out of the Tennessee frontier with his own hands, the land he had crossed hundreds of miles to reach, the land that had defined his life and his family's life for nearly 2 decades. His shoes began flying off his feet. Richard would replace them, tie them tight, then they would fly off once again. Then came the blow to his face, something like an open hand. Then John just sat down on that log. His face began twitching and contorting. And from the woods around them came shrieking laughter from every direction at once. The laughter that had no source because it had every source. The presence felt like it was everywhere and nowhere and in the middle of it. On a log on his own land, John Bell wept in front of his son. Richard looked at his father and heard him say something that I think is one of the most honest sentences in this entire account. "Not long will you have a father to wait on so patiently. I cannot much longer survive the persecutions of this terrible thing. It's killing me by slow tortures, and I feel that the end is nigh." That's a man telling his son hard truth. He wasn't performing for a room. He wasn't trying to convince anyone of anything. He's sitting there on a log on his own land with tears on his face, telling his son what he knew. And then he did something that Richard had apparently never seen him do, at least not with that intensity before. He got on his knees and he prayed. It wasn't a formal prayer, not the measured prayer of a man going through familiar motions. He asked that if it were possible, this affliction might pass. He asked for courage and faith for his family.
You're going to say Gethsemane, aren't you?
I am. I want to be careful here because I'm not drawing a direct theological parallel between John Bell and Jesus. That would be irresponsible. But the shape of that prayer, "If it were possible, let this pass," is the shape of a man who has reached the end of his own resources and is desperately asking God for something he isn't sure is coming. The garden prayer is the prayer of someone who knows what's ahead and asks anyway, not demanding or bargaining, asking and then accepting. A calmness settled over John. The episode faded. Father and son walked back to the house together, but John Bell would never leave again. That detail lands harder every time I read it. It doesn't have a vial or blue flame or dramatic singing. It's just a man who walked back to his house and didn't leave, who knew on some level that the walk back was the last one, and who prayed with everything he had in a field while something laughed at him from every direction and then got up and walked home anyway. It's not a man who was destroyed by what came for him. It's a man who was broken by it and chose faithfulness anyway. And those are not the same thing. Now the vial and the cat and the singing. The theatrics. John Bell died on December 20th, 1820. That is confirmed by court records. Everything else, though, the vial found in the place of the medicine, the dark brown fluid nobody could identify, the cat they tested it on and it convulsed and died, the blue flame that shot up the chimney, the voice declaring in a joyous tone that it had given old Jack a big dose last night while he was asleep, which fixed him, it said. All of that comes from Ingram's compilation and not from independently verified contemporary sources.
Meaning the most dramatic parts of the story have the least support. I ain't surprised.
Look, Doc, the death was very real. How it happened, sure, is up for debate. But I want to sit with what the accounts describe theologically, regardless of whether every detail is accurate. A being that openly declares its role in a man's death, at his funeral while his family grieves, singing wild songs in the crowd, not hiding, not ashamed, claiming credit with what witnesses described as joy. Whether the accounts are accurate or not, the theology of what they describe is clear. The enemy comes to steal, kill, and destroy. John 10:10. Some of you have always read that as metaphorical. This case and the many others we've covered on this show prove otherwise, I think. We know the death is not where this ends, and I think what happens immediately after deserves more attention than it usually gets. Almost immediately after the burial, the entity stops tormenting Betsy Bell. Not gradually or with slow withdrawal, but almost immediately, Betsy returned to something resembling herself for the first time in years. Some of the accounts report of it changing its disposition toward Betsy, but they don't come from Ingram. We noted them in part 1. We don't know for sure if it became nice to her, but it did leave her alone. And I think, for her, that would have been good enough. I also think the aftermath tells you everything about what John Bell was to this thing. Betsy was never the destination. I think she was leverage. She was the means by which the entity maintained its hold on that household and kept John Bell from being able to protect himself or find peace. The moment John Bell was gone, Betsy was no longer useful in that capacity, and the entity shifted its behavior toward her almost immediately.
Which is a colder reading of a torment than most people consider.
It is. And I think Betsy deserves that honesty more than she deserves a comfortable version of events. She was 12 years old when it started. She was pulled from sleep, struck without cause, smothered repeatedly, humiliated in front of the people she loved, driven to the point of saying she'd drink poison to be free of it all. And the reason for all of it, if the accounts are accurate, wasn't that she had done anything or that the entity had any particular interest in her destruction. It's just that she was useful. She was the youngest, the most vulnerable. She was a tool for getting at her father.
Yo, I'm starting to think that's a specific kind of evil that's harder to sit with than that dramatic kind.
The dramatic kind, the vials, the blue flames, the singing at the funeral, those are vivid and terrible, to be sure, but the cold kind, the deliberate selection of a child as an instrument of leverage against a man the entity had already decided to destroy, that's the kind that doesn't go away when the lights come on. There is one more moment in this record that the analysis has to address, and it may be the most practically important one that made me think of my recent conversation with Tim on the Sixth Sensory podcast. Sadly, they never engaged the entity with anything resembling the deeds of Jesus and the apostles, and nothing they did attempt did any good. Not the detectives, not the conjurers, not the committees, not Andrew Jackson, not the man with the silver bullet, not the incantations and charmed shotguns or mixed concoctions. None of that worked. All of them left worse than they arrived, or left without resolution, or left having learned something painful about the limits of their own confidence. But one evening, the family was gathered around the fireplace after supper, and something got their attention, and they heard,
I am going, and will be gone for 7 years. Goodbye to all.
Yo, that's so creepy how it announced its departure.
Yeah, it did announce its departure on a specific timeline, and that it kept its word according to the records. The presence that had occupied that farm for years, that had beaten a detective on the floor and escorted a conjurer home on a runaway horse and stopped Andrew Jackson's wagon on a public road, it said it was leaving for 7 years. And it left.
Where did it go?
Oh, we don't know, and the accounts don't say. What they preserve is the announcement and the absence, 7 years of nothing at the Bell Farm. Whatever purposes required its presence there had apparently been fulfilled, and it left on its own timeline toward its own purposes, the same way it had operated from the beginning.
Did it come back like it promised to?
It did. 7 years later, in February of 1828, they say the disturbances began again. The knocking, the scratching at the bedpost, the covers pulled away in the night. The farm was occupied only by Lucy and her sons, Richard and Joel, by that point. But this time the family made a decision. They agreed not to speak a word about it, not to engage it, to simply go on as if nothing were happening and see if it would leave on its own.
Oh, come on, there's no way that worked.
Well, according to the record, after 2 weeks, it did work. And I want you to chew on that for a moment, because that's, in the context of everything we've discussed, remarkable and uncomfortable. It deserves more than a passing mention because it is the only successful response in the entire record. 2 weeks of deliberate, unified, sustained disengagement. No investigations, no more committees, no conjurers, no silver bullets, no future presidents, no engagement of any kind. Just the determination that said, we are not going to give you what you want from us. Everything we've established in this massive 2-part analysis points toward what that something was. Attention, audience, engagement, performance, the fear of being known, the reaction of the person being tormented, the room full of witnesses, the community gathering night after night to see what would happen. All of it fed something. All of it sustained something. And when Lucy Bell and her son simply refused, when they closed the door on all of it and went about their lives as if nothing were happening, the thing that had beaten and defeated so many couldn't sustain itself against 2 weeks of being ignored. That's both the most practical and most theologically loaded conclusion in this entire case. I want to connect it to something Paul said in Ephesians 4. Do not give the devil a foothold. The word translated foothold is topos in the Greek, place or space. Don't give the devil a place. Don't create the conditions in which he can establish and maintain a presence. The Bell Farm gave it a place for years through the investigations, the engagement, the conjurers, the committees, the crowds gathering night after night. The moment the remaining family withdrew that place, well, it stopped providing the topos. It left within 2 weeks.
Wait a minute. You're saying the community's engagement was part of what kept it there?
I'm saying if this part of the account is accurate, that is certainly what it suggests, at least in part. I'm not blaming them. I understand why they came. I understand why they stayed. What was happening at that farm was genuinely extraordinary, and the human response to the genuinely extraordinary is to gather and look, to gawk. But whatever this entity was, it operated in the space that engagement created. They didn't bring it, but they may have created the circumstances in which it thrived. Thrived in the room full of witnesses. It fed on the attention of the county, and when that attention was finally, deliberately, collectively, and quietly withdrawn, it found the conditions it wanted, or perhaps needed, were no longer present. Refusing to provide an audience, that is one of the major lessons, I think. Not for every situation. I want to be careful here because there are times when Scripture calls us to directly engage. It calls us to direct engagement with the kingdom of darkness, and that engagement is necessary and right at the right time. Discernment, I think, tells us the right time. But for some reason, in some way, for this kind of entity operating in this way, feeding on this kind of attention, it appears that the withdrawal of said attention was the one thing in this entire record that produced a positive result. And Lucy Bell figured that out. After everything she had been through, after years of that thing in her house, after her husband's death, after watching her children suffer, she figured out what none of the investigators or conjurers or generals had. Lucy Bell, who fed travelers at her table and kept her household together through years of the inexplicable and buried her husband and went on anyway, Lucy Bell is the one who closed the file. Not by confronting it, nor by defeating it, but by refusing to participate in it. And that's no small matter, folks. The entity also announced it would return after another 7 years, and after that, another 100. The tradition preserves those numbers as a kind of schedule, 7 years, then 107. The circle closing around 1935, the county waited. Some claimed faint voices, unexplained lights, nothing like what had come before, nothing that gathered a crowd.
Maybe because nobody gave it one.
Maybe. Or maybe because whatever it had come to do in Robertson County was finished, and the farm that had been its stage was empty, and the family that had been its main audience was gone, and there was nothing left worth staying for. It said it would be back. What it found when it returned, if it returned, the record doesn't say.
Now, hold on, mister. Ain't your show doing exactly what the Bell family did all them years? Ain't you providing an audience and making a spectacle of these things you claim to believe in?
Oof. That's probably one of the most serious objections you've raised on the show, and it deserves a serious answer rather than a dismissal. You're not wrong about the principle. The Bell case itself does suggest that engagement feeds something. We said that explicitly. Lucy Bell figured out what none of the investigators figured out, and she did it by refusing to participate. That's in the record. But there is a category difference between the engagement that sustained the presence on that farm and what this show is about and what it's doing or trying to do. And that difference matters theologically. What sustained the entity at the Bell Farm was a specific kind of engagement. Crowds gathering night after night to witness performances, conjurers arriving to test their craft against it, detectives coming to expose it, committees forming to investigate it. All of that engagement shared a common quality. It treated the entity as the subject, as the thing worth orienting toward, as the center of the room. That is not what this show is doing. This show is using the Bell case, as well as all the other cases we cover, as a lens to examine Scripture. Every time we have returned to the record, it has been to illuminate something the biblical text already says. The taxonomy of demonic behavior in the Gospels, the architecture of spiritual warfare in Ephesians, the significance of daimonizomai, the pattern of Saul at Endor, the warnings of Matthew 12, the territorial language of Daniel 10 and Isaiah 34. In the company of night creatures. The entities are not the subjects of this show. The Scriptures are the subject of this show. The entities are the case studies. There's a long and serious tradition of exactly this kind of engagement in Christian theology. Demonology as a discipline exists not to glorify the demonic, but to understand it well enough to resist it effectively. The failure of every minister who came to the Bell Farm was not that they thought about darkness, it was that they thought about it without adequate theological depth. They confirmed the phenomenon and stepped back. They prayed without authority. They engaged without understanding. This show exists precisely to correct that failure. At least, that's my goal. Your objection, Doc, if genuine, is protecting something real. The instinct that says we should not give darkness more attention than it deserves is a good instinct, and it comes from a good place. But there is a difference between giving darkness an audience and studying darkness in order to recognize it, resist it, and equip people who are going to encounter it, whether they want to or not. Ephesians 5:11 is key here, I think. Have nothing to do with the fruitless deeds of darkness, but rather expose them. I seek to expose them. People are going to encounter these things. They already have. They already are. The question is whether they encounter them having thought carefully about what the Scripture actually says, or whether they encounter them with the same theological shallowness that left the Bell family without anyone who could actually help for years. Lucy Bell's strategy of disengagement worked in a specific set of circumstances with a specific entity that had already accomplished its primary purpose, in my opinion, and was now operating in a diminished capacity on a return visit. That strategy does not scale to every encounter with darkness, or else you'd see Jesus go through the Gospel saying, "Oh, you're demonized? Just ignore it for long enough and it'll go away." See, that does not equip the church for spiritual warfare. It does not prepare anyone for anything. It just keeps the room quiet, and a quiet room is not the same thing as a protected one. Another thing to consider is the entity didn't give them the opportunity to ignore it when it was tormenting their children every night. In any case, the Bell Witch, whatever it was, eventually left Robertson County. But it left something behind, and I don't mean the cave. I don't mean the legend. I mean something more specific and more dangerous than either of those things. By 1875, the entity itself had not been active at the Bell Farm for decades. John Bell was long dead. The house had changed hands. The family scattered. The primary witnesses gone. What remained was the story. And the story had done something to Robertson County that our analysis has yet addressed. It had permanently altered what that community believed was possible. We close out where we began last week's analysis.
Oh, that's right, the Smith case.
Yes, Vinny, the Smith case. A man appeared in the Red River area calling himself simply Smith. No known family, no verifiable history, no connection to the community beyond farm work. But he talked, and what he said drew attention. He claimed unusual abilities, hypnotism, influence, the power to bend another person's will. And he said those abilities didn't come from study or practice alone. He said they came from the Bell Witch.
Which in most places at most times would have gotten him laughed out of the county.
In most places at most times, maybe so, but this was Robertson County, and that name still carried a lot of weight. It was not just a story people told. It was something people remembered deeply. Something that had never been fully explained or resolved, something their parents and grandparents had not read about but witnessed. To claim a connection to it was not harmless. It placed him inside something the community had already learned not to take lightly. And two men believed him and greatly feared him, Thomas Clenard and Richard Burgess. They worked alongside him. They came to believe that Smith had exerted genuine control over them, that he had used their fear as leverage, that they were no longer acting entirely of their own will. Whether that influence was real or perceived, it settled into them in a way they could not shake, and eventually they killed him.
And I can't believe them jokers were acquitted.
Yeah, they were acquitted. The defense was not self-defense in the usual sense. It was built on the claim that Smith had placed them under his influence through something they understood as hypnotism or witchcraft, and that they had acted to free themselves from it. The jury heard that argument in Robertson County in 1875, and they accepted it. No further action was taken. A man was killed, and the explanation that satisfied the court was essentially he was practicing something connected to the Bell Witch, and we had no other way out. That is what the verdict says, and I want you to chew on what the verdict reveals, not about Smith or about Clenard and Burgess, but about what the Bell Witch had done to that community at a level deeper than the haunting itself. It had permanently altered the epistemological framework of Robertson County. The category of genuine supernatural coercion was not theoretical to that jury. It was not a Gothic superstition imported from somewhere else. It was lived experience passed down through families who had been in those rooms, who had heard that voice, who had watched a man die while something sang at his funeral. 12 people sat in a jury box in 1875 and heard a claim about supernatural influence and believed it was possible because they had been raised in a community where it had already been demonstrated to be possible. The Bell Witch didn't need to be present to influence that verdict. It had done the work decades earlier. The permanent alteration of a community's framework of belief is itself a form of ongoing influence. The entity was long gone, the terror structure it had established was not, though, and Smith understood that. Whether he was a fraud, a genuine practitioner of something, or simply a manipulative man who knew how to weaponize a community's existing fear, the name worked. It gave him credibility, it gave him leverage. It made two grown men afraid enough of him that they eventually killed him to escape said fear. He didn't need the Bell Witch to be real, he needed the community to believe it had been real, and Robertson County had given him that belief, fully formed and ready to use. Though he bit off more than he could chew. It's actually a more sophisticated kind of lasting damage than I usually think about when I think about hauntings. Most people think about hauntings in terms of what happens while the entity is present. The sounds, the physical manifestations, the torment, and those things are real and they matter, but what the Smith case shows us is that the damage doesn't end when the presence ends. It ends, if it ends, when the community's framework returns to something that can evaluate claims about supernatural influence without the prior experience of the Bell Witch making those claims automatically credible. Robertson County never fully got there. The Bell Witch had been too real, too witnessed, too corroborated across too many families for the framework to reset. And that permanent alteration, that installed belief, and the genuine possibility of supernatural coercion became a vulnerability, something a man named Smith could walk into 50 years later and exploit with nothing more than a name and a claim.
Which means the legend's influence outlasted its presence by decades, possibly longer.
Possibly much longer, Doc. Because the framework Smith exploited in 1875 didn't disappear with his death or with the verdict. It was passed down. It became part of how Robertson County understood the world, and the question our analysis can answer, and I want to be honest about that, is whether that altered framework was a byproduct of the haunting or whether it was part of the purpose of it all along.
Wait, you're suggesting the community destabilization was intentional?
I'm suggesting that a being intelligent enough to wait 2 nights before beating a detective, patient enough to let a conjurer work for 3 days before correcting him, anxious enough to have watched civilizations rise and fall, that kind of being does not produce 50 years of downstream community vulnerability as an accidental side effect. The Kingdom of Darkness plays the long game. In a community that can be made to believe supernatural coercion is real, that can be made to acquit a killer on those grounds, that carries that belief in its bones across generations, that community is more vulnerable to the next Smith, and the one after that. The Bell Witch may have been gone, but the door it opened in Robertson County stayed open for a very long time. It is exactly why the closing of doors matters as much as the resistance to what comes through them. Lucy Bell's 2 weeks of silence closed one door. The verdict of 1875 tells us that other doors, the ones opened in the community's collective understanding of what was real and possible, those doors were still open half a century later. And a man named Smith walked right through one of them. What do we do with all of this, my friends?
Sounds like we sleep with the lights on, apparently.
Same thing I always tell you. You don't seek this out. You don't open doors and hope something manageable comes through. You don't go to the cave on Saturday night with a lantern and a sense of adventure and think you're going to be fine because, well, you said a prayer first. The entity in these accounts didn't respect John Bell's righteousness, his community standing, his generosity, his position at church, or his faith. It didn't respect the committees, the investigators, the general, or the man with the silver bullet. What it did respect, the one relationship in that entire household that looked different from all the others, was a young man, John Jr., who, when he engaged it directly, refused to be afraid of it, refused to accept its self-presentation uncritically, and consistently pointed it toward its own accountability before God. That's not a method or a technique, that's a posture. It's the posture Paul described, I think, in Ephesians 6, having done all, stand. Friends, don't go looking for the fight, but please don't pretend the fight isn't real either. Stand your ground. You know who you are in Christ. Don't flinch. John Jr. wasn't immune because he was special. He was later immune because he refused to give it what it wanted from him, which was fear and compliance. And the one thing this entity could not do across years of documented interaction was make John Bell Jr. afraid of it. And then there was Lucy in the end, Lucy the widow, who didn't confront it, who didn't engage it, who simply went about her life and refused to participate in it after it took her husband. And after 2 weeks, it left her and her remaining family alone. Two postures, both rooted in the same thing, a refusal to give the enemy what he needs from you to operate. John Jr. refused to give it fear last week. Today, Lucy refused to give it an audience. Neither of them gave it jurisdiction, and in a record full of people who left worse than they arrived, those two are the ones who didn't. The Bell Witch is over 200 years old as a story, and what I find remarkable is that the more carefully you read the primary sources, with all their sourcing problems fully acknowledged, the less it behaves like a legend. Legends simplify over time. This one gets stranger the closer you get to it, more specific, more internally consistent, more theologically coherent than it has any reason to be if someone just made it all up. I believe something happened on that farm. What exactly? I'm uncertain. Ancient demonic entity? Almost certainly, based on the behavioral profile. Something older and stranger that intersects with what Scripture describes in Genesis 6 and Isaiah 43? Possibly. Something God permitted for purposes none of the people involved could have fully understood. The pattern of John Bell's suffering invites the question, even if it can't provide the answer. What I'm certain of is this: it was not Kate Batts. It was not frontier hysteria, it was not ventriloquism or string, and it was not something that a clever enough person with a good enough camera was ever going to catch or contain. It was intelligent, it was ancient, it was capable of cruelty and of something almost resembling honesty, sometimes in the same conversation. And whatever it was, according to what the tradition preserved, it said it would be back. On that cheerful note, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits. Thank you for listening, my friends, to part 3 of the Bell Witch saga. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something from it, or were at least challenged by something in it. I ask, please share this episode. Tell somebody about it. That's the only way people are going to find out about the show. If you want to help me continue to do deep, deep dives like this one, join the Toasties on Patreon and help me keep the lights on. Links for everything, as always, are in the show notes. I want to thank you all for listening today to The Dancing Toaster, wherever you're listening. Like, share, subscribe, comment, leave me a review, follow, do all the things wherever you consume The Dancing Toaster. But whatever you do, don't consume toasters, and don't let any ancient spirits consume you. I love you. I'm out.
Report suspicious activities and call 911 for immediate response. Expect delay.
Nobody else moving tags in from the south. Stand by. Flight 022. Maintain approach. You're clear for runway.
Expect traffic delays and restrictions. Take personal security precautions to avoid becoming a victim of an attack. Avoid crowded public areas and gatherings.
Roger, 527. Maintaining southbound runway 8 kilo. Holding.
Do not travel in areas affected by the attack or in a known area elevated virus activity. Keep emergency supplies accessible and a full tank of gas at all times.
Be careful.
Government officials insist that this is isolated incident of the attack in the Perhaps the Bureau continues to inform